We're now fortunate to have four distinguished and experienced diplomats and analysts. The name of Michale Aron, Barbara Bodine, Nabeel Khoury, and Mustapha Noman. So now the floor is yours.
I mean, I very much agree with everything that Noel, Stephen, and Samuel have said. There's nothing that I strongly disagree with. I suppose as an opening point, I think it is interesting that the P5 in general are relatively united on Yemen in a way which they certainly aren't in Syria and Libya. And occasionally we've managed to make use of that. There is a difference of opinion over Iran, particularly the sort of, I think there have been attempts over the years, particularly by the Americans, to sort of try and pin more of the blame on Iran publicly and in the UN and so on, which have been resisted by the Russians and Chinese. But by and large, the meetings that I've been to with Martin Griffiths over the years, with P5 ambassadors, we've been violently agreeing with each other on most things. And, particularly in Vladimir and I agreed very much, which I think is probably unusual in terms of foreign policy issues at the moment for the UK and Russia to be in such agreement. So I think that is interesting and is at some point could be useful when the time is right, which I don't think it is at the moment, to try and sort of bring things to a head, some sort of peace moves, as it were, if it's about convening and so on. And it was useful in Stockholm, I think, as we can argue about whether Stockholm was a good result, but I think that the role of the P5 was instrumental, was important in supporting Martin Griffiths' efforts to bring about an agreement. So that's the first thing. Specifically on the UK, just because I think it is certainly in my time, which is since the last 3 and a bit years, it's been very much looked at through a prism of Saudi Arabia, and even more than CT. I think, in fact, on the CT side, some people are worried that, well, some people think that the continuation of the war is probably not a bad thing from a narrow CT point of view, in the sense that Yemen is not an international source of terrorism at the moment because of the war. And there have even been people who've said, "Oh, we've got to be a bit careful about working towards peace, because in the context of peace, as Noel suggests, it's quite possible you'd see a resurgence of either AQAP or Daesh." I mean, I don't think that's serious, but it's not completely irrelevant. But certainly, it isn't at the moment looked at in a CT context at all. It is looked at in terms of regional security and our relationship with Saudi Arabia. I think in terms of our relationship with Saudi Arabia, I think it has been, despite what people might say, it's great that we go on selling them weapons, and therefore we would obviously want to continue the war so that we can make more money from selling them weapons. I think that is, it's an interesting debating point. It's totally false in practice, because I think our very strong view is that it is massively in Saudi Arabia's interests to end the war for Saudi Arabia and regional security. And therefore, I would say that the bulk of efforts over the last few years have been to try and help Saudi Arabia, first of all, to persuade Saudi Arabia that they did want to end the war as quickly as possible. And then post-September 19, with the Abqaiq attack, when I think, at which point, my view is that MBS realized that the war was very much against Saudi interests. The continuation of the war was very damaging for Saudi Arabia, because it had enabled Iran to make an attack on Saudi Arabia's critical oil infrastructure and get away with it. Astonishingly, really, when you think about it, that they were able to lob missiles straight into the middle of Saudi Arabia's oil infrastructure and suffer no consequences whatsoever, because the obfuscation of the Houthi pretending to be responsible for it and so on. So since September 19, I think the Saudis, as Noel said, have wanted to end this. They haven't quite. I think there was a period in the autumn of 19, beginning of 20, when there were direct discussions between the Saudis and the Houthis, where if the Saudis had, as Noel says, a bit more a bit better understanding of where the Houthis were coming from, a bit more people to put into the frame, that if they had really made an effort to be brave and go beyond the comfort of their discussions they were having with the Houthis, that they could have got a deal then, which they're prepared to sign up to now, but which the Houthis have moved on from. The Houthis have moved on in the last 2 years to extend their, whereas then I think the Houthis would have taken an end to the so-called blockade and a ceasefire and so on. I think the Houthis were ready at that point and would have signed up to it. Now they want much more withdrawal of foreign forces and so on. So the Houthis have moved the goalposts, but it was a failure. It was an inability to conclude a deal back at the end of 19, early 20, before the Maghreb attack started and so on, which I think was a very narrow opportunity. And I'm not blaming anybody for it really, but I think that was the closest we've come to an opportunity to end the fighting. As far as the UK is concerned, we will continue to try and encourage and so on, we see that and work with Saudi Arabia in the sense that we do see them very much as it being in their interest. They are the players, they have levers, they have influence. And I mean, we can come and probably discuss this more in subsequent, the other questions, but I do think Afghanistan has had will have had a major impact probably on all sides. But the Saudis will certainly look at it and think, would we do what the Americans have done, to copy what the Americans have done in Afghanistan, i.e. to have a limited withdrawal, as it were, would be, is not, they'll be very, very nervous about doing it. Just as the Houthis will be sitting there thinking, we are the Taliban, let's just wait until everybody basically gives up and hands over power to us. So I think that Afghanistan, but let's save that discussion for subsequently.
It's interesting that I have understood more about the in-depth of the policies or the politics that are, I would say, motivating the politicians in the UK, US, and Russia. I agree with Michael about that one of the problems of Yemen, that it's not a very lucrative location for big countries to invest in. Yemen is, as Michael rightly said, it's always looked at from the Saudi prism, how to secure Saudi Arabia. And my logic has always been that Yemen is vital and important to the international community because we are next to 12 million barrels a day. That's why Yemen is so important, not because there are too many resources. We are not like Libya, we're not like Iraq, and not even like Syria, which is like an important player because of its geopolitics there. And hence, that was the difficulty, that the United States and UK, who are the main or the major influencers in the Yemeni war, either by supporting the Saudis and the Emiratis by selling them arms, which is it might be a pure commercial deal, or that they think that that the Saudis need these arms to defend themselves. And it might be sarcastic to see that the Saudis on each attack on any of their installations, which I condemn, even if it targets a military side, they call for the defense of the superpowers. That's for me something is like defending them from the Houthis. And I recall that in April 2015, Ahmed Asiri went public and declared the end of the decisive storm, and that it has achieved 95% of its goals. And that leads me to a question. Were the Saudis unaware of what's happening in Yemen? Were they not aware of the real dimension of the military power that Saleh has accumulated during the years. Were they misinformed? Were they pushed to go to this war without preparing it? Going into a war, an air campaign, without allies on the ground that will push with you, because an air campaign can never win a war alone unless you have military on the ground, and that had never happened. And that will lead me to the, not a question, but to wonder about the information and the intelligence information that were given to them by the British intelligence services, military, or the MI5, and the intelligence that were given to them by the United States. And as we know that Obama himself has said it, that they stopped giving this information towards the end of his term. So that would mean that the Americans and the British were seriously involved in this war. They cannot just say, no, we were just trying to support the Saudis against it. To try to reinstate Hadi and the legitimacy, and then taking 2216 as a pretext for the continuation of this war. We all know 2216 was like 1 month later after the war started. The war started in March, and 2216 was drafted in April. The Russians abstained, so to please the Saudis or not to veto it. My third point is about the Russian involvement. I don't think the Russian has any leverage on this process more than what they can do in the Security Council. And they might use Yemen as a tool for other resolution that they want to pass, either for Syria, Libya, Iraq, or the other countries around the world. But for Yemen, Yemen is not as strategic to them, to the Russians, as Syria or as Libya. The wealth in Libya is so appetizing for everyone. So, and the Russians had some influence during Saleh because of the arms sales, but they did not have, they were never involved politically. They have never had like counterterrorism policies in Yemen. They have never intervened in the process of promoting democracy. They have not given Yemen any economical assistance. They were not the donations, or during the donors conferences that were held in London, their presence was minimal if they were ever present. So combining these three views about the United States, UK, and Russia, it is very clear now that the only country that has a real leverage that is trying to play it on the Saudis are the Americans, and they are playing it. The British are doing it, but of course, because of the magnitude of the relations between the Saudis and the Americans, and the importance of this relation for the succession of the throne in Saudi Arabia, it is vital for MBS to get along with the Americans. And at this time, he is trying to bow, to let this storm goes away. He thinks that within a year or two, especially next November, he thinks that if the House and the Senate changes camp and the Republicans go back to the majority, that will help him. And this is why he's playing it cool with the Americans, getting along with them wherever they want to take him, believing that it is time that is really vital for both sides. He thinks that he has 1 year to go. If he can resist these 12 months, that would be good for him. And that also has to be taken into the context of whether his father, the king, will remain for another year alive, or would he pass away? And it's a matter of time. He's ailing, and we know about his health. So the Saudis, although they claim they want to weigh out, as Michael said, since 2019, and they have heard it, and Nabeel heard it, everybody heard it, that they want a way out, but they cannot find it. They cannot find the starter point. Where do they start? They know the Houthis now, they feel that they are stronger militarily, and they are stronger within the international community, and that they can claim victory. And this is what the Saudis, or specifically MBS, will never, in my view, he will never concede. He will never take the decision Abdel Nasser took in 1967 when he decided, while he had 70,000 troops on the ground, that he decided that he cannot win this war and he had to quit.
We sell arms to the Saudis and the Emiratis for a variety of reasons, but not just solely to make money. But I do think, and it came out particularly in Noel's and Stephen's comments, that there's a large measure of misunderstanding of both Saudi Arabia and Yemen in London and Washington that helped fuel our policy towards this war. I think that there was an overestimation of, I think in some ways, of Saudi importance, and the Saudis know I think that. Both Saudi capacity and Saudi capability, and whether or not the Saudis even really had a plan going into Yemen. My understanding is that they did launch the attack with very little notice to us, and whether or not our ambassador had flagged it, that's not quite the same thing as actually knowing that it was going to happen. But there was I think there was a lack of depth of understanding of what the Saudi capacity was to even do a military operation. I think most of us who have worked on the peninsula for a long time know that despite decades of military assistance and military training, the Saudis really couldn't hit a stationary object if it was standing in front of them. And that they are not given to putting boots on the ground. And I completely agree. And most military analysts would agree that you cannot win a war from 30,000 feet. So the idea that the Saudis could go in 2 weeks, this scruffy little group of Houthis would collapse in the face of Saudi military might was, fantastical. From both sides, because it also, I think, represents a lack of understanding of the dynamics within Yemen and what was driving this conflict and who the Houthi were and what the degree of both dissatisfaction with the Saleh government, but also the degree of antipathy towards most things Saudi within Yemen. And I would say my British colleagues can also tell me, agree or not, that usually when somebody comes in and bombs your country to a great extent, you tend to actually get your back up. And I think the British very well demonstrate that. It tends to solidify opposition rather than crush. For Americans, I would say, take a look at our bombing of Hanoi. These kinds of campaigns are not going to work. It was never going to work in Yemen. So we overestimated the Saudi capacity. I think we overestimated our relationship with Saudi Arabia. And I think that all sides very much misunderstood the dynamic within Yemen and how this was going to play out. I would also say, I do think that there was a fundamental misalignment of our policy towards Yemen and the British when we shifted to a CT focus. At least when I was ambassador, we had very much of a development and liberalization focus. And I had some conversations with Ali Abdullah Saleh when he wanted to know if we would sell him or provide him more weaponry. And the answer was no. And it wasn't because the Saudis weren't going to like it. It was just because they didn't need it and they couldn't use it. But when we shifted to CT, both of us, and if we shift back to CT when and if this war ends, we are going to have a very distorted policy towards Yemen, because in a sense, what we're asking Yemen to do is revert to being our proxy war. What we don't like about this current war is that we can't pursue our own proxy war of going against Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And we didn't really see Yemen as an active partner. We saw them as a compliant partner. But it very much took our eye off the ball as to what was going on in terms of the political and economic development, and therefore the root causes of the collapse of the Saleh regime and the ultimate civil war. So we need to, I think there is a deeper realignment of our approach to Saudi Arabia with Biden versus Trump. I think most Americans, or at least Americans who follow these things, were rather appalled at the Trump embrace of the Saudis. And I think the Saudis overplayed it. If Mohammed bin Salman thinks that a return to a Republican Congress is going to be to their benefit, they're very badly misjudging, I think, the degree of anti-Saudi sentiment on the Hill. And so that would be another miscalculation by the Saudis, who are so good at those. So I think we need to sort of bring into focus a much more realistic, candid appraisal of who Saudi Arabia is as a partner, how their actions actually fit with our interests, what we can expect from them, and the degree to which they are going to act independently to pursue their interests. And then I would also hope that at some point, we are able to once again work with Yemen as Yemen, and not work with Yemen as a dependent participle to our relations with Saudi Arabia. I will very much underscore what Mustapha said, is that, you know, we do need to recognize Yemen's own strategic interest and our own interest in a not secure Yemen, which is a militarized Yemen, but a stable, sustainable Yemen. And if you really want to get at CT, you get away from the idea of dropping drones and you start focusing on actual development, actual governance, actual state building. And to the extent, as I said, if we revert to CT, we are going to undo whatever comes out of this war, and we will just simply be setting Yemen up for continued failure.
Would anyone else like to comment at this stage?
Yeah, I was going to make some statements, but I'd like to give my time to Nabeel.
Because of tensions with Saudi Arabia, the US is not able to use leverage to move the Saudis, even on a simple initiative, relatively simple initiative, such as the reopening of Sana'a airport and relieving of the siege around Hodeidah. The US, the Biden administration would like to do that, but they're not being able to move the Saudis on this, let alone on some big picture items. There's been an oscillation starting with the Obama administration and until now. Obama had a certain vision of a world without the use of force, of a world where big powers and regional powers collaborate, and a world in the Middle East, which was transitioning to democracy and development, where the US could play a big diplomatic and economic role. The problem with that vision is that Obama was too timid to actually cut the ties with the old world alliances, with the Cold War mentality, with the counterterrorism focus, and who was traditionally considered to be the allies of the US in the region in counterterrorism. Now with Biden, I think Biden learned a few lessons from having served in that administration. So he is being somewhat bolder in the departure from Afghanistan, for example. That was a very bold move on his part. Obama wanted to do it, but could not. So Biden went and bit the bullet and made that decision and executed it. On Yemen, he also started very boldly by stating right from the start that the goal here is to end the suffering in Yemen, stop the war, end the humanitarian suffering. Excellent. He followed that with appointing a special envoy. I felt very optimistic the first 3 to 6 months of this administration on Yemen. I felt that they are serious, they are putting resources behind it, diplomatic mainly, and that they could actually bring about peace. After 6 months, I must say I began to be disappointed. I think the initiative has stalled. And normally in any negotiating for peace, you have to accomplish something, a building block in the first 6 months. And after that, build on it. But there has been nothing concrete accomplished in 9 months now that passed. And so I'm beginning to lose hope in the Biden administration's attempt to end this war.